The F-35 Lightning II screamed across the California desert at Mach 1.8, its afterburners carving orange trails through the twilight sky. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rebecca Hayes gripped the controls with white knuckles as her heads-up display flashed red warning after red warning. The enemy submarine lurking beneath the Pacific waves had just fired a ballistic missile toward the California coast, and every second counted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But Rebecca wasn't supposed to be here. According to the mission briefing that had concluded just 20 minutes ago, she should have been sitting in the officer's lounge, sipping coffee and looking pretty while the real pilots handled the real work. After all, that's what General Mitchell's daughter was good for, wasn't it? Decoration. The missile streaking toward Los Angeles carried enough explosive power to level downtown. 12 million people had no idea death was racing toward them. At 3,000 miles per hour, the submarine had disappeared beneath the thermal layers, invisible to sonar, untouchable by conventional weapons. Only one solution remained, and it required a pilot willing to fly directly into the missiles' path at the exact moment of interception. A suicide mission. Rebecca Mitchell had volunteered without hesitation, and every person in that briefing room had laughed. The morning had started like any other at Edwards Air Force Base. Sarah Mitchell parked her dented Honda Civic in the Findue visitors' lot, careful to avoid the spots reserved for officers. At 28 years old, she had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds' brown hair, pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, wearing faded jeans and a UCLA sweatshirt that had seen better days. The security guard barely glanced at her civilian ID as she passed through the gate. She wasn't military. Never had been, despite growing up on more Air Force bases than she could count. While other kids played house, Sarah had built model fighter jets and memorized aircraft specifications. While other teenagers worried about prom dates, she was studying aeronautical engineering at MIT. But none of that mattered now as she walked across the tarmac toward Hangar 7, carrying a worn leather briefcase that contained documents most people would never be cleared to see. The briefing was already underway when she slipped through the side door. 50 of the nation's top military personnel filled the room, their attention focused on the massive screen, displaying satellite imagery of the Pacific Ocean. Sarah found an empty chair in the back row, setting her briefcase quietly on the floor. Nobody noticed her arrival. Why would they? She was just another civilian contractor, probably here to take notes or serve coffee. Colonel David Thompson stood at the podium, his weathered face grin as he gestured toward the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, at 0400 hours this morning, our satellites detected an unidentified submarine approximately 200 miles west of Los Angeles. Initial analysis suggests it's a Typhoon-class nuclear submarine, though no nation has claimed ownership. Major Lisa Rodriguez, the base operations officer, leaned forward in her front row seat. Her perfectly pressed uniform bore enough ribbons to outfit a small parade, and her reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her intolerance for weakness. Sir, our P-8 Poseidons have been conducting search patterns for 6 hours. The submarine has gone dark. No thermal signature, no acoustic signature. It's like it vanished. Captain James Wilson, squadron leader of the base's elite F-35 unit, raised his hand. His call sign was Viper, earned during 3 tours in the Middle East where his precision strikes had become legendary. Colonel, what's the threat assessment? Are we looking at a reconnaissance mission or something more aggressive? Thompson's expression darkened. 47 minutes ago, the submarine surfaced briefly and launched a single missile. Our tracking stations confirm it's an RS-28 Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, modified for submarine launch. Current trajectory puts it on a direct path for downtown Los Angeles. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Voices overlapped as officers began calculating response times, discussing interception options, and coordinating with NORAD. Sarah remained silent in her corner, her fingers tracing the edge of her briefcase. She had designed the tracking systems that detected that missile. She had written the algorithms that calculated its trajectory, but nobody in this room knew that. Sergeant Mark Davis, head of base security, was already on his radio coordinating evacuation protocols. Sir, at current speed, the missile will reach Los Angeles in approximately 18 minutes. Even if we scramble every available aircraft, we can't establish an effective interception corridor in time. What about the Patriot missile systems? Asked Lieutenant Amy Chun, the air traffic controller who had been monitoring civilian flight patterns all morning. Her voice carried the strain of someone who understood that 12 million lives hung in the balance. Thompson shook his head. The missiles traveling at Mach 23. Our Patriots are designed for much slower targets. They'd be like trying to stop a bullet with a baseball bat. Major Rodriguez stood, her mind already working through tactical options. Sir, what about a nuclear interception? We could detonate a low-yield warhead in the missile's path, create an electromagnetic pulse that would disable its guidance systems. Negative, Thompson replied immediately. The risk of radioactive debris over populated areas is too high. We need a conventional solution. Captain Wilson leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. Colonel, with respect, I don't think a conventional solution exists. The missile's too fast, too high, and we have insufficient response time to establish proper targeting solutions. Sarah Mitchell listened to the conversation with growing frustration. These were brilliant military minds, some of the best tactical thinkers in the world, but they were thinking like soldiers. They were focused on weapons and systems and overwhelming firepower. They weren't thinking like engineers. She opened her briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered with handwritten calculations. The numbers represented 3 years of theoretical work, models she had run in her spare time while working as a civilian contractor for various defense projects. Nobody had asked for this research. Nobody had funded it. She had done it because the possibility had kept her awake at night, the knowledge that someday, someone might need a solution to an impossible problem. The room fell silent as Colonel Thompson consulted his watch. 15 minutes until impact. I'm open to suggestions, people. Because right now we're looking at the largest loss of civilian life on American soil since. There is a way. Every head in the room turned toward the back corner where Sarah Mitchell sat quietly, her hand raised slightly. Colonel Thompson squinted in her direction, clearly trying to place her face among the sea of military personnel. I'm sorry, who are you? Thompson asked, his voice carrying a note of irritation. This is a classified briefing for authorized personnel only. Sarah stood slowly, her movements deliberate and calm despite the weight of 50 pairs of eyes. On her, Sarah Mitchell, civilian aerospace contractor. I have level 5 clearance for theoretical weapons analysis. Major Rodriguez turned in her seat, her expression skeptical. Ms. Mitchell, this isn't a theoretical exercise. We have 14 minutes to prevent a catastrophic attack on American soil. Unless you have practical experience with missile interception systems. I don't, Sarah interrupted quietly. But I have practical experience with collision mathematics. And I know how to stop that missile. Captain Wilson let out a short laugh. Ma'am, with all due respect, we have some of the finest tactical minds in the military working on this problem. If there was a solution, we would have found it by now. Sarah looked directly at him, her voice steady and clear. The solution requires a pilot willing to die for it. The room went completely silent. Even the constant background chatter of radio communications seemed to pause. Colonel Thompson stepped down from the podium, walking slowly towards Sarah's position in the back of the room. Explain, he said simply. Sarah opened her briefcase fully, revealing not just the single sheet of calculations, but dozens of pages of research, diagrams, and theoretical models. The missile is traveling at Mach 23, but it's following a ballistic trajectory. That means its path is predictable within a margin of error of less than 50 meters. We know that, Major Rodriguez said impatiently. That's why we've been trying to calculate interception vectors. But no aircraft can match that speed, and no weapon system can achieve the necessary precision at that velocity. You're thinking about interception, Sarah continued, spreading several diagrams across the table nearest to her. I'm talking about collision. A properly timed head-on collision with an aircraft traveling at maximum speed would create enough kinetic energy to destabilize the missile's guidance system and alter its trajectory by several degrees. Lieutenant Chun leaned forward, her eyes widening as she began to understand the implications. Several degrees would be enough to send it into the Pacific instead of downtown Los Angeles. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The collision doesn't have to destroy the missile outright. It just has to nudge it off course enough to miss populated areas. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Wilson stood, his face flushed with anger. That's not a solution. That's a suicide mission. You're talking about a deliberate head-on collision at combined speeds of over Mach 25. No pilot would survive that impact. No, Sarah agreed quietly. They wouldn't. Sergeant Davis shook his head vigorously. Ma'am, we don't sacrifice pilots on suicide missions. That's not how we operate. There has to be another way. There isn't, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. I've run every possible scenario over the past 3 years. Every conventional interception method fails because of the speed differential and response time. This is the only solution that works within our current constraints. Colonel Thompson studied the diagrams Sarah had spread across the table. The calculations were incredibly complex, filled with variables for atmospheric density, missile trajectory, aircraft performance specifications, and collision dynamics. But even at a glance, he could see the mathematical elegance of the solution. These calculations, he said slowly. Where did you develop them? MIT, initially, during my doctoral work in aerospace engineering. But I've been refining them for 3 years while working on various defense contracts. I always knew that someday, someone might need to stop something unstoppable. Major Rodriguez walked over to examine the papers more closely. Despite her skepticism, she had enough technical background to recognize sophisticated mathematical modeling when she saw it. These trajectory calculations, they're incredibly precise, but they assume perfect timing. A fraction of a second, early or late, and the collision vector would be completely wrong. Which is why it requires the best pilot we have, Sarah replied. Someone with experience in high-speed interception, precision targeting under extreme conditions, and the reaction time to make microsecond adjustments during approach. Captain Wilson crossed his arms, his expression still hostile. And you think someone in this room is going to volunteer for a guaranteed death mission, based on theoretical calculations from a civilian contractor? Before Sarah could respond, the room's emergency communication system crackled to life. A voice from NORAD filled the space with urgent precision. Edwards Base, this is Cheyenne Mountain. Missile impact in 11 minutes, 30 seconds. Los Angeles International Airport has begun emergency evacuation procedures. Estimated civilian casualties exceed 10 million if current trajectory holds. The weight of those words settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. 10 million people. Children, families, elderly grandparents, college students, all going about their normal Saturday morning routines while death screamed toward them at 23 times the speed of sound. Colonel Thompson looked around the room at his assembled officers. These were men and women who had volunteered to serve their country. who had sworn oaths to protect American lives even at the cost of their own. But asking someone to fly a deliberate suicide mission was different from accepting the risks of combat. It was asking them to choose certain death. "The math checks out," Major Rodriguez said quietly, still studying Sarah's calculations. "The collision vector would work. The timing windows are incredibly narrow, but they're achievable with our best pilots." "It's murder," Captain Wilson said flatly. "We'd be asking someone to commit suicide with extra steps." "It's sacrifice," Sarah corrected, her voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to her civilian status. "It's one life to save 10 million. That's not murder, Captain. That's what heroes do." Lieutenant Chun looked up from her radar screens, her voice shaking slightly. 10 minutes, 40 seconds to impact. "We need to make a decision now if we're going to attempt this." The room descended into heated discussion as officers debated the ethics, the practicalities, and the implications of Sarah's proposal. Some argued for attempting a conventional interception despite the low probability of success. Others suggested evacuating coastal areas and accepting the devastating loss of life. A few began calculating which pilot had the best chance of successfully executing such a precise collision. But Sarah Mitchell sat quietly in her corner, watching the debate with an expression of calm resignation. She had spent 3 years running these calculations, 3 years preparing for this exact scenario. 3 years knowing that someday she might have to present this solution to a room full of military leaders. She had also spent 3 years knowing that when that day came, there would be only one person qualified to fly the mission. Herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was General Robert Mitchell's daughter, the little girl who had grown up on military bases, dreaming of becoming a pilot. She had applied to the Air Force Academy twice and been rejected both times, not for lack of qualifications, but because her father's influence had kept her out. "Flying is too dangerous for my little girl," he had told her. "Find something safer." So she had become an engineer instead, designing the systems that guided the aircraft she wasn't allowed to fly. She had earned 3 degrees, written classified research that protected millions of lives, and developed technologies that advanced American military capabilities by decades. But in the eyes of people like Captain Wilson, she was still just a civilian contractor, a woman playing at understanding things that were too complex for her feminine mind to grasp. They had no idea that she held a private pilot's license with instrument ratings for both single and multi-engine aircraft. They didn't know about the hundreds of hours she had logged in flight simulators, practicing high-speed interception maneuvers and precision targeting. They couldn't imagine that the general's daughter had spent her weekends at private airfields, paying cash for advanced flight training that rivaled anything the military provided. And they certainly didn't know that she had been designing this mission, not just as a theoretical exercise, but as a practical plan she might someday have to execute herself. 9 minutes to impact, Lieutenant Chun announced, her voice cutting through the increasingly desperate conversations. NORAD is reporting that the missile has begun its terminal descent phase. If we're going to attempt interception, it has to be now. Colonel Thompson raised his hand for silence. "All right, people, we need a decision. Dr. Mitchell's calculations appear sound, but we need a volunteer. Someone with the skill to execute a precision collision at those speeds." The room fell silent as officers looked at each other, weighing professional duty against personal survival. These were brave men and women, veterans of combat who had faced death before, but this was different. This was choosing death, embracing it, flying directly into it at supersonic speeds. Captain Wilson stood slowly, his face pale but resolute. "Sir, I'll do it. I have the most experience with high-speed interception. If anyone can make those timing calculations work." "No," Sarah said quietly, standing from her corner chair. "You can't fly this mission, Captain." Wilson turned toward her, his expression mixing gratitude with confusion. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you're trying to do, But this isn't a time for civilian sentiment. If there's going to be a sacrifice, it should be made by someone who signed up for it. You can't fly this mission, Sarah repeated, her voice growing stronger, because you don't know the aircraft well enough. The collision vectors require modifications to the F-35's flight systems that haven't been tested. The pilot needs to understand not just how to fly the plane, but how to override its safety protocols and push its performance envelope beyond design specifications. Major Rodriguez frowned. What kind of modifications? Sarah opened her briefcase again, withdrawing a thick manual that looked like it had been handwritten. I've been working with Lockheed Martin on theoretical performance enhancements for the F-35, modifications that would allow it to achieve speeds and maneuverability that exceed its published specifications. The changes require real-time programming of the flight computer during the approach phase. That's impossible, Captain Wilson said immediately. The F-35's flight systems are hardwired for safety. You can't override them mid-flight without months of preparation and testing. You can't, Sarah agreed. But I can. I designed the override protocols. I know every line of code in that flight computer because I wrote half of them. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Several officers leaned forward, suddenly seeing Sarah Mitchell in a completely different light. She wasn't just a civilian contractor offering theoretical advice. She was one of the engineers who had built the systems they flew every day. Colonel Thompson studied her with new interest. Ms. Mitchell, are you suggesting that you're qualified to fly a combat mission in an F-35 Lightning? I'm suggesting that I'm the only person in this room qualified to fly this specific mission in an F-35 Lightning. I know the aircraft systems better than anyone except the original design team. I know the flight envelope modifications that will be required. And I know the exact timing and approach vectors that will make the collision successful. But you're not military, Sergeant Davis protested. You don't have combat flight experience. You've never flown under enemy fire or handled the stress of a life-or-death mission. Sarah looked at him with an expression that was almost sad. Sergeant, this mission isn't about combat experience or handling stress. It's about precision engineering and mathematical execution. It's about making a series of incredibly complex calculations while flying at speeds that human reflexes can't handle. It's about understanding the aircraft well enough to push it beyond its design limits without losing control. She paused, looking around the room at the assembled officers. And it's about accepting that the mission ends with the pilot's death. I've had 3 years to accept that reality. I designed this mission knowing that I might someday have to fly it myself. Lieutenant Shun's voice cut through the tension. 7 minutes to impact. We need to make a decision now. Colonel Thompson walked over to Sarah's position, studying her face carefully. He had been in the military for 25 years, and he had learned to read people under pressure. What he saw in Sarah Mitchell's eyes wasn't bravado or reckless heroism. It was the calm acceptance of someone who had thought through every aspect of a difficult decision and made peace with the consequences. Miss Mitchell, he said quietly, do you understand what you're volunteering for? This isn't a rescue mission with a small chance of survival. This is certain death. The collision forces alone would be instantly fatal, even if the aircraft somehow remained intact. I understand, Colonel. I've run the calculations on human survival during high-speed collision events. The G-forces would render me unconscious within 2 seconds of impact, and death would follow within another 3 seconds. It would be quick. Major Rodriguez shook her head in disbelief. You've calculated your own death? I've calculated the parameters of the mission, Sarah corrected. Death is simply one of the variables. It's not the most important one. Captain Wilson stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching respect. Ma'am, what is the most important variable? Sarah looked at him directly, her voice steady and clear. Success. 10 million people go home to their families tonight. Children finish their homework, parents read bedtime stories, grandparents celebrate birthdays. That's the most important variable, Captain. Everything else is just mathematics. The room fell silent except for the constant background hum of radio communications and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary. A civilian volunteer calmly discussing her own death as if it were a routine engineering problem to be solved. Colonel Thompson made his decision. Miss Mitchell, do you hold current pilot certifications? Yes, sir. Private pilot with instrument ratings, current medical certification, and over 800 hours of flight time in various aircraft types, including 40 hours in F-35 simulators. Simulator. Time doesn't equal combat readiness, Captain Wilson pointed out, though his tone had lost its earlier edge. No, Sarah agreed, but this mission doesn't require combat readiness. It requires precision flying and systems knowledge. I can provide both. Thompson consulted his watch. 6 minutes. If we're going to attempt this, we need to move now. He looked around the room one final time. Anyone have any other options? Anything at all? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Finally, Major Rodriguez spoke for the group. Sir, it's the only option that has any chance of success. The math is sound, and Miss Mitchell clearly understands the systems involved better than anyone else available. 5 minutes, 30 seconds. Lieutenant Chun announced, her voice tight with stress. Colonel Thompson nodded grimly. Ms. Mitchell, you're authorized for immediate flight operations. Sergeant Davis, get her suited up. Captain Wilson, I want you in the tower coordinating approach vectors. Major Rodriguez, contact NORAD and let them know we're attempting interception. As the room erupted into coordinated activity, Sarah Mitchell calmly closed her briefcase and stood to follow Sergeant Davis toward the equipment lockers. She felt strangely peaceful, as if the weight of 3 years of preparation had finally lifted from her shoulders. She had spent so long knowing this day might come, and now that it was here, there was only the mission. Captain Wilson caught her arm as she passed his position. Ms. Mitchell. Sarah, why? Why volunteer for certain death? You could have stayed quiet. Let someone else figure out a solution. Sarah paused, considering the question seriously. Captain, 3 years ago, I started working on these calculations because I had nightmares about exactly this scenario. A missile heading for a major population center, no conventional way to stop it, millions of lives hanging in the balance. I kept working on the problem because I knew that someday, someone would need a solution. She looked toward the hangar doors where an F-35 Lightning was being prepared for the most important flight in its operational history. It never occurred to me that someone else would fly the mission. This is my solution to my nightmare. It seems appropriate that I should be the one to implement it. As she walked away toward what everyone in the room knew was certain death, Captain Wilson found himself wondering if you would have had the same courage. Around him, 50 of the nation's finest military officers were coordinating the most unusual mission in Air Force history, supporting a civilian volunteer flying the suicide mission to save 10 million lives. None of them yet knew that Sarah Mitchell was the daughter of the most decorated general in the Air Force. None of them knew that she had been fighting for military recognition her entire life, only to be denied because of her father's overprotective influence. And none of them suspected that this mission would reveal not just her courage, but her true identity as one of the most qualified pilots never allowed to serve. The general's daughter was about to prove that decoration could be deception, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people nobody expects to be warriors. The equipment locker smelled of leather and jet fuel, filled with flight suits hanging like empty ghosts waiting for their pilots. Sergeant Mark Davis pulled down a standard issue flight suit, holding it up against Sarah's frame with obvious skepticism. At 5'6" and maybe 130 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone about to attempt the most dangerous flight in military history. "Ma'am, this is going to be loose on you," Davis muttered, checking the size tags. "These suits are designed for our regular pilots, and frankly, most of them are bigger than you are." Sarah took the suit without comment, running her fingers along the fabric. It was surprisingly heavy, reinforced with Kevlar and equipped with systems she had helped design but never worn. The name tape read Thompson. Apparently she was borrowing the colonel's spare gear. She wondered if he knew his equipment might not come back. "The helmet's going to be the real problem," Davis continued, pulling down a white flight helmet covered in switches and displays. "If it's too loose, you'll lose consciousness during high-G maneuvers. Too tight, and you'll get a concussion before you even reach the target." "Sergeant," Sarah said quietly, stepping behind a privacy screen to change, "in approximately 4 minutes, I'm going to fly directly into a ballistic missile traveling at 23 times the speed of sound. I don't think helmet fit is going to be my primary concern." Davis paused in his equipment preparation, the reality of the situation hitting him fully for the first time. He had suited up hundreds of pilots for thousands of missions, but never for one where success was defined by the pilot's death. His hands shook slightly as he continued organizing the gear. Sarah emerged from behind the screen wearing the flight suit, and Davis had to admit she looked more credible than he had expected. The suit fit reasonably well, and she moved in it with the confidence of someone familiar with the equipment. She wasn't fumbling with the zippers or struggling with the unfamiliar weight distribution like most civilians would. "You've worn one of these before," he observed, not really asking. "Simulator training," Sarah replied, sitting down to pull on the flight boots. "I've logged significant time in F-35 simulators for my engineering work. You can't properly test flight system modifications without understanding how they feel to the pilot." Davis helped her with the survival vest, checking each pocket and connection point with professional thoroughness. The vest contained emergency rations, medical supplies, flares, and a dozen other items designed to keep a downed pilot alive in hostile territory. All of it was useless for Sarah's mission, but military protocol demanded proper equipment regardless of circumstances. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Davis said as he adjusted the vest's shoulder straps. "Of course. Why didn't you tell them who your father is?" Sarah's hands stopped moving on the vest buckles. She looked up at Davis with surprise, studying his weathered face carefully. "How do you know about that?" "I've been base security for 8 years. Part of my job is knowing who has clearance to be where. When someone shows up with level 5 theoretical weapons clearance, I run background checks." Sarah Mitchell, daughter of General Robert Mitchell, 3 degrees from MIT, currently working on classified defense contracts for 6 different aerospace companies. Davis tightened a strap with perhaps more force than necessary. "The question is why you're not telling them." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer. Through the thin walls of the equipment room, she could hear the controlled chaos of mission preparation. Radio chatter, running footsteps, the distant whine of an F-35's engine spinning up for pre-flight checks. "Because it wouldn't change anything," she finally said. "My father's reputation doesn't make me a better pilot or a better engineer. It certainly doesn't make this mission any less dangerous. It might make them take you more seriously. Sergeant, in 3 minutes I'm going to climb into that aircraft and fly towards certain death to save 10 million people. How much more seriously could they possibly take me?" Davis had no answer for that. He finished the equipment check-in. Silence running through the mandatory safety protocols, even though both of them knew the irony involved. When he was finished, Sarah looked like any other Air Force pilot, ready for any other mission. "One more thing," Davis said, reaching into a storage cabinet. He pulled out a small device that looked like a digital recorder. Emergency beacon. If something goes wrong with the mission parameters, if you change your mind, if you need to abort. For any reason, activate this and every search and rescue asset in the Pacific will come looking for you. Sarah took the device, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than it looked, packed with satellite communication equipment and GPS tracking technology. She understood what Davis was really offering. A way out. A last-minute escape from. A choice that could never be undone. "Thank you," she said, clipping the beacon to her vest. They both knew she would never use it. The walk from the equipment room to the flight line took less than 2 minutes, but it felt like crossing from one world into another. Behind them lay the familiar realm of briefing rooms and theoretical discussions, where problems were solved. With mathematics, and nobody actually died. Ahead lay the concrete reality of military aviation, where theory became practice and mistakes had consequences measured in human lives. The F-35 Lightning II sat on the tarmac like a predatory bird, its angular surfaces painted in the gray camouflage that made it nearly invisible against cloudy skies. Ground crew swarmed around the aircraft, performing final checks and loading. The specialized equipment Sarah had requested. The plane's single engine was already running, filling the air with the distinctive howl of military-grade thrust. Captain James Wilson stood beside the aircraft wearing his own flight suit, his helmet tucked under his arm. Sarah had expected him to remain in the control tower, coordinating her approach vectors from the safety of the command center. Seeing him here, ready to fly, sent an unexpected chill through her stomach. "Captain," she called out as she approached. "I thought you were handling tower communications." Wilson turned toward her, and she could see something had changed in his expression. The hostility and skepticism were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "Change of plans, Dr. Mitchell. I'm flying escort." "Escort?" "Someone needs to verify your interception approach, confirm target acquisition, and report mission success or failure back to base. That's going to be me, flying parallel track at safe distance." Sarah stopped walking, understanding immediately what Wilson was really saying. He was volunteering to watch her die. He was going to fly close enough to the collision point to witness the impact, close enough to confirm that her sacrifice had achieved its intended result. It was an act of professional courage that she hadn't expected from someone who had been questioning her qualifications 20 minutes earlier. "Captain, that's not necessary. The collision will be visible on radar. NORAD will be able to confirm impact and trajectory change from their tracking stations. Radar can tell us what happened," Wilson replied. "It can't tell us why it happened or whether the mission parameters were executed correctly. If this works, if your calculations are accurate and 10 million people go home safe tonight, someone needs to be there to witness it. Someone needs to be able to tell the story of what you did." Major Lisa Rodriguez emerged from the control tower, jogging across the tarmac toward their position. Her usually perfect uniform was disheveled, and she carried a tablet computer that was scrolling, with constantly updating data feeds. 2 minutes until missile impact," she shouted. "Dr. Mitchell, we need you airborne immediately." Sarah began her pre-flight inspection, running her hands along the aircraft's surfaces while mentally reviewing the checklist she had memorized from hundreds of simulator sessions. The F-35 was a beautiful machine, packed with technology that represented decades of engineering advancement. Under normal circumstances, she would have been thrilled to fly it. Under these circumstances, it felt more like climbing into her own coffin. "Dr. Mitchell," Rodriguez said, catching up to her position near the aircraft's nose. "I've been reviewing your calculations during the preparation time. The mathematics are elegant, but I have concerns about the execution." Sarah looked up from her inspection. "What kind of concerns?" "The timing windows you've calculated are incredibly narrow. You'll have less than 2 seconds to make final adjustments to your approach vector. At the speeds involved, even a slight miscalculation could Send the missile into populated areas instead of the ocean. I understand the risks, Major. Do you? Rodriguez stepped closer, lowering her voice so the ground crew couldn't overhear. Because I'm not sure you understand the pressure you're going to face up there. Flying at maximum speed toward a head-on collision while making split-second calculations based on sensor data that's updating faster than human cognition can process. Most pilots would lose consciousness from stress before they could complete the mission. Sarah paused in her inspection, considering Rodriguez's words seriously. The Major was right about the technical challenges. The human brain simply wasn't designed to process information at the speeds this mission would require. Reaction times that seemed instantaneous during normal flight operations would be hopelessly slow when measured against the physics of ballistic interception. Major, you're absolutely correct about human limitations. That's why I've spent 3 years developing automated assistance protocols for exactly this scenario. Rodriguez frowned. What kind of automation? Sarah reached into her flight suit and withdrew a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. Collision prediction software, linked directly to the F-35 sensor array. It calculates optimal approach vectors in real time and displays them on the heads-up display. The pilot still has to execute the maneuvers, but the mathematical calculations are handled by computers operating at machine speed. You've tested this system extensively in simulation. The software has successfully calculated collision vectors for over 300 theoretical scenarios, including variations in target speed, altitude, atmospheric conditions, and aircraft performance parameters. Captain Wilson had been listening to their conversation while conducting his own pre-flight checks on his aircraft. Dr. Mitchell, are you saying you've basically turned this into a video game? Follow the computer prompts and crash into the target? Sarah looked at him sharply. Captain, I'm saying I've eliminated as many variables as possible to maximize the probability of mission success. The collision itself will still require precise flying under conditions that would challenge any pilot. But the mathematical calculations that determine approach timing will be handled by systems designed for that purpose. 1 minute to impact. Lieutenant Amy Chun's voice crackled over the tarmac speakers, cutting through their technical discussion. All aircraft need to be airborne immediately. Sarah climbed the ladder to the F-35's cockpit, settling into the ejection seat with practiced efficiency. The cockpit was exactly as she remembered from simulator training, packed with displays and controls that represented the cutting edge of aviation technology. She began the abbreviated startup sequence, bringing primary systems online while ground crew removed the external power connections. Captain Wilson was climbing into his own aircraft, a second F-35 that would serve as his observation platform. Through her canopy, Sarah could see him running through his own startup procedures with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The radio crackled to life in her helmet. Ghost One, this is Edwards Tower. You are cleared for immediate takeoff, any heading, any altitude. Current missile position is 40 seconds from downtown Los Angeles. Repeat, 40 seconds to impact. Sarah advanced the throttle to military power, feeling 35,000 pounds of thrust pushing her back into the seat. The F-35 accelerated down the runway with the urgency of an aircraft designed for combat, reaching takeoff speed in less than 15 seconds. As the landing gear retracted, she could see the California desert falling away beneath her, peaceful and unchanged despite the catastrophe racing toward the coast. Ghost 2 airborne. Captain Wilson's voice came through her headphones. I have visual contact, forming up on your left wing. Sarah looked out her canopy to see Wilson's F-35 flying in perfect formation, close enough that she could see his face through his helmet visor. He gave her a small salute, a gesture of respect between pilots that transcended their earlier disagreements. Edwards Tower, Ghost One, request vector to intercept. Ghost 1. Missile is currently bearing 270 at Angels 45. Speed Mach 23 and accelerating. Your intercept window opens in 28 seconds. Sarah activated the collision prediction software, watching as her heads-up display filled with computer-generated approach vectors. The system was tracking the missile's position through data feeds from NORAD, calculating optimal intercept points and displaying them as a series of glowing symbols overlaid on her view of the sky. 20 seconds to intercept window, the tower announced. Ghost 1, are you ready to commence final approach? Sarah looked down at the California coastline spread out below her aircraft. Somewhere down there, 10 million people were going about their Saturday morning routines, completely unaware that their lives hung in the balance of decisions being made at 40,000 feet. Children were playing in parks, families were having breakfast, elderly couples were reading newspapers and planning their weekend activities. Edwards Tower, Ghost 1, commencing attack run. She pushed the throttle to maximum afterburner and felt the F-35 leap forward like a living thing. The heads-up display showed her approach vector as a tunnel of light leading directly toward a point in space where mathematics predicted the missile would be in exactly 18 seconds. At the speeds involved, there would be no room for second-guessing or last-minute changes. Once committed to the approach, physics would take over. 15 seconds to intercept. Wilson's voice came through her headphones. Sarah, I can see the missile's exhaust trail. It's right where your calculations predicted. Through her canopy, Sarah could see a thin line of white vapor stretching across the sky like a chalk mark drawn on blue paper. The missile was still, invisible to her naked eye, but her aircraft sensors were tracking it with electronic precision. The collision software updated constantly, showing minor corrections to her approach angle as new data refined the intercept calculations. 10 seconds to intercept. Ghost 1, you are on perfect approach vector. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, her breathing calm and regular despite the fact that she was flying directly toward her own death. She thought about her father, General Robert Mitchell, who had spent her entire life trying to protect her from exactly this kind of danger. She wondered what he would say if he could see her now, using skills he had tried to prevent her from developing to save lives he would never know existed. 5 seconds to intercept. I have visual contact with the missile. And there it was, a tiny silver speck growing larger at impossible speed. The Russian Sarmat missile was smaller than she had expected, about the size of a telephone pole, but moving with the kinetic energy of a small meteorite. In 3 seconds, it would either continue toward Los Angeles or be knocked off course into the Pacific Ocean. 2 seconds to impact. Ghost 1, you are dead on target. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, thinking of all the children who would grow up because of what was about to happen. All the parents who would read bedtime stories tonight, all the grandparents who would celebrate birthdays next week, all the families who would never know how close they had come to losing everything. Impact in 3, 2, 1. The collision happened faster than human perception could process. At a combined speed of over Mach 25, the F-35 and the Russian missile occupied the same point in space for approximately 2 milliseconds. The kinetic energy released was equivalent to several tons of conventional explosives, creating a fireball visible from 50 miles away. Captain Wilson, flying 2 miles behind the impact point, was temporarily blinded by the flash. When his vision cleared, he could see debris scattered across several cubic miles of sky, tumbling toward the ocean in pieces too small to identify. The missile's trajectory had changed by exactly 4 degrees, sending it into the Pacific Ocean 40 miles west of Los Angeles instead of into downtown. Edwards Tower, Ghost 2, impact confirmed. Missile trajectory successfully altered. Target will impact in the Pacific, approximately 40 miles offshore. Repeat, mission successful, Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell saved them all. 10 million people in Los Angeles continued their Saturday morning routines, completely unaware that they had just been saved by a woman whose father had spent her entire life telling her that flying was too dangerous. 3 hours after the successful missile interception, the mood in the Edwards Air Force Base Command Center should have been celebratory. 10 million civilians had been saved from certain death. A catastrophic attack on American soil had been prevented, and military personnel had witnessed perhaps the most heroic act of self-sacrifice in modern warfare. Instead, the atmosphere was thick with uncomfortable tension and barely suppressed hostility. The problem wasn't what had happened in the sky 40 miles off the California coast. The problem was what was happening now in this sterile conference room where Sarah Mitchell sat facing a panel of senior military officers who seemed more interested in assigning blame than acknowledging heroism. General Patricia Harrison, commander of Air Combat Command, had arrived from Langley Air Force Base within 2 hours of the incident. She sat at the head of the long conference table, her silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her expression stern and unforgiving. To her right sat Colonel David Thompson, who had authorized Sarah's mission and was now clearly regretting that decision. To her left sat Major Lisa Rodriguez, whose earlier respect for Sarah's mathematical abilities had apparently evaporated in the harsh light of military bureaucracy. But it was the man sitting directly across from Sarah who represented the real source of tension in the room. General Robert Mitchell, her father, had arrived on a military transport just 30 minutes ago, and his face showed a mixture of relief, fury, and something that might have been betrayal. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," General Harrison said, consulting the thick file of reports that had been compiled in the hours since the incident. A civilian contractor, with no military authority and no combat experience, somehow gained access to a $60 million fighter aircraft and flew an unauthorized suicide mission into restricted airspace. Sarah sat perfectly still in her chair, wearing a borrowed Air Force uniform since her civilian clothes had been destroyed in the equipment preparation process. The uniform didn't fit properly, and she felt like a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. More importantly, she felt the weight of 40 years of military tradition and protocol being used as weapons against her. "Ma'am," Colonel Thompson interjected, "the mission was authorized under emergency protocols. We had less than 5 minutes to prevent a catastrophic attack on Los Angeles. Dr. Mitchell provided the only viable solution." "Dr. Mitchell," General Harrison repeated, emphasizing the civilian title, "provided a theoretical framework for a suicide attack. She did not have authority to implement that framework personally, regardless of the time constraints involved." Major Rodriguez leaned forward, her voice carefully neutral. "General, the mission parameters required someone with extensive knowledge of F-35 flight systems and the specific modifications needed to achieve intercept velocity. Dr. Mitchell was uniquely qualified to execute those requirements." "Dr. Mitchell," General Harrison said, looking directly at Sarah for the first time, "was uniquely qualified to provide technical consultation. She was not qualified to fly a military aircraft into combat, regardless of her theoretical knowledge or simulator experience." Sarah had remained silent during the first 20 minutes of what was clearly a formal inquiry, but she could feel the familiar frustration building in her chest. She had sacrificed everything to save 10 million lives, had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and was now being treated like a criminal who had stolen government property for a joyride. "General Harrison," she said quietly, "with respect, the mission succeeded. The missile was intercepted, civilian casualties were prevented, and the threat was neutralized. I understand there are procedural concerns, but the results speak for themselves." The room fell silent, and Sarah realized she had just made a serious mistake. In military culture, civilians didn't speak until spoken to during formal inquiries. And they certainly didn't question the judgment of senior officers. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as General Harrison fixed her with a stare that could have melted steel. "Dr. Mitchell," Harrison said, her voice dangerously calm, "you seem to be under the impression that results justify means. Let me disabuse you of that notion immediately. This is the United States Air Force, not a civilian aerospace company. We operate under strict protocols and clear chains of command. You violated both." Colonel Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "General, I authorized Dr. Mitchell's participation in the mission. If there were protocol violations, the responsibility lies with me." "Colonel Thompson," Harrison replied without taking her eyes off Sarah, "you authorized a civilian to fly a military aircraft into combat without proper clearance, without adequate training, and without following established emergency procedures. Your career is already over. We're here to determine how much damage Dr. Mitchell has done to military discipline and operational security." Sarah felt her heart rate increasing as the reality of the situation became clear. This wasn't a debriefing or an after-action review. This was a formal inquiry designed to assign blame and impose punishment. The fact that she had saved 10 million lives was apparently less important than the fact that she had violated military protocols in the process. Furthermore, General Harrison continued, consulting her notes, "We have serious questions about how Dr. Mitchell gained access to classified flight system information, how she developed unauthorized modifications to military aircraft, and whether her actions constitute a breach of national security protocols." Major Rodriguez looked genuinely surprised. "General, Dr. Mitchell holds Level 5 clearance for theoretical weapons analysis. Her access to F-35 specifications was completely legitimate." "Her access to specifications was legitimate," Harrison agreed. "Her development of unauthorized flight system modifications was not. Dr. Mitchell, where did you conduct the testing and development of the software you used during the intercept mission?" Sarah realized she was walking into a trap, but she had no choice but to answer honestly. The software was developed using commercially available flight simulation programs, combined with theoretical modeling based on published aircraft specifications. "Commercially available programs," Harrison repeated. "You're telling this panel that you developed mission-critical software for a $60 million fighter aircraft using video games and theoretical models? The simulation programs are the same ones used by aerospace manufacturers for initial system testing," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice level. "The modeling was based on extensive research into high-speed collision dynamics and aircraft performance parameters." General Robert Mitchell spoke for the first time since the inquiry had begun, his voice heavy with disappointment and barely controlled anger. "Sarah, do you have any idea what you've done?" The use of her first name in a formal military setting sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Several officers glanced between Sarah and the general, clearly trying to process the implications of the familiarity. "I saved 10 million lives," Sarah replied, looking directly at her father. "I prevented the largest loss of civilian life on American soil since September 11th. I used my education, my training, and my knowledge to solve a problem that had no other solution." "You stole a military aircraft," her father shot back, his composure finally cracking. "You flew an unauthorized mission into restricted airspace. You put yourself and others at risk based on untested theories and amateur software development." "The theories weren't untested," Sarah said, her own voice rising. "I spent 3 years developing and refining the collision calculations. I ran hundreds of simulations, consulted with experts in ballistic physics, and validated every aspect of the intercept mathematics." "Simulations," General Harrison interjected, "are not reality. Mathematical models are not combat experience. You gambled with 10 million lives based on theoretical work that had never been verified under actual conditions." Sarah stood up from her chair, forgetting military protocol in her frustration. "General, the mathematical models were proven correct. The intercept was successful. The missile was destroyed exactly as predicted, and its trajectory was altered by precisely the amount my calculations indicated. How is that gambling?" "Sit down," Harrison ordered sharply. "You do not have permission to stand during this inquiry." Sarah remained standing, feeling 30 years of suppressed anger and frustration finally reaching the surface. "With respect, General, I'm not subject to military discipline. I'm a civilian contractor who volunteered to save lives when no one else could provide a solution." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Colonel Thompson closed his eyes, clearly recognizing that Sarah had just made her situation infinitely worse. Major Rodriguez looked like she wanted to crawl under the table, and General Mitchell looked like he was watching his worst nightmare come to life. "Dr. Mitchell," General Harrison said, rising from her own chair, "you may be a civilian, but you are currently on a military installation, participating in a formal military inquiry, and answering for actions that directly affected military operations. You will follow military protocol, or you will be removed from this base and face federal charges for interfering with national defense." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between impossible choices. Her entire life had been defined by situations where following the rules meant accepting injustice, where military protocol was used to silence dissent and protect incompetence. She had watched her father choose institutional loyalty over individual conscience countless times, and she had sworn never to make the same compromise. "General Harrison," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do, "I understand your concerns about protocol and chain of command. But I need you to understand something about the situation we faced 3 hours ago." She walked to the front of the room, ignoring the shocked expressions of the assembled officers. "The Russian submarine that launched that missile didn't care about our protocols. The ballistic trajectory that would have killed 10 million. Americans didn't pause for proper authorization. The physics of high-speed collision dynamics don't adjust themselves to accommodate military bureaucracy." "Dr. Mitchell," Colonel Thompson said urgently, "please sit down. You're making this worse for yourself." "I'm making this honest," Sarah replied, turning to face the panel of officers. "For 28 years, I've watched this institution prioritize appearances over results, protocol over performance, and political considerations over moral obligations. I've seen brilliant officers destroyed for having inconvenient opinions, and incompetent leaders promoted for following orders. Without question." General Mitchell stood up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Sarah, that's enough. You're out of line." "Am I?" Sarah asked, looking directly at her father. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I'm the only person in this room who's willing to acknowledge what actually happened today. A Russian submarine fired a ballistic missile at Los Angeles. Every conventional response failed. I provided a solution that worked. 10 million people are alive because I was willing to sacrifice myself for them. You provided a solution that violated every principle of military discipline and operational security," General Harrison said coldly. "Your actions, regardless of their outcome, represent a fundamental breakdown in the chain of command that governs all military operations." Sarah laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Chain of command. Let me tell you about chain of command, General. 3 hours ago, the chain of command had no solution to offer. The chain of command was prepared to watch 10 million Americans die rather than authorize an unconventional response. The chain of command would have preferred a catastrophic failure that followed proper procedure to a successful mission that violated protocol." The room was completely silent now, with several officers looking genuinely uncomfortable. They had all participated in the decision-making process that led to Sarah's mission, and they all knew that she was telling the truth about the lack of conventional alternatives. Major Rodriguez found her voice. "Dr. Mitchell, no one is questioning The value of the lives you saved. We're questioning the precedent your actions set for future operations. What precedent? Sarah asked. That when faced with an impossible situation, someone might choose to act based on knowledge and capability rather than rank and authority? That when 10 million lives hang in the balance, results matter more than procedure? The precedent. General Harrison said that civilians can commandeer military assets and fly unauthorized missions whenever they disagree with official decisions. The precedent that individual judgment supersedes institutional authority. The precedent that anyone with theoretical knowledge can ignore military discipline and do whatever they think is right. Sarah stared at Harrison for a long moment, recognizing the fundamental disconnect between their worldviews. To the general, military discipline was an end in itself, a system of order that had to be preserved regardless of consequences. 2. Sarah, military discipline was a tool that should serve larger purposes, and when the tool failed to serve those purposes, it needed to be set aside. General, Sarah said quietly, what would you have done if you had been in that briefing room 3 hours ago, listening to reports that a ballistic missile was going to kill 10 million Americans, and the only solution required someone to violate military protocol? What would you have been willing to sacrifice? The lives of 10 million civilians, or the purity of your chain of command? I would have found a solution that didn't require violating fundamental military principles, Harrison replied without hesitation. There wasn't one, Sarah said simply. I spent 3 years looking for alternatives. Every conventional approach failed because of physics, not because of lack of effort or imagination. The missile was too fast, too high, and too close to populated areas for any standard intercept method. Colonel Thompson cleared his throat. General, I was in the briefing room. Dr. Mitchell is correct about the lack of conventional alternatives. We had less than 5 minutes to prevent impact, and no military response could have been implemented in that time frame. Which brings us to the real issue, General Harrison said, fixing Sarah with another withering stare. How did you happen to have a complete solution ready for implementation? How did you happen to have specialized software, detailed flight plans, and precise timing calculations available for a scenario that supposedly had never occurred before? Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized where the inquiry was heading. The questions weren't really about protocol violations or military discipline. They were about whether her preparations for this mission constituted evidence of prior knowledge, possible espionage, or even collaboration with foreign intelligence services. I developed the solution because I was afraid something like this might happen, she said carefully. I spent 3 years working on theoretical responses to ballistic missile attacks because I believed the threat was real and growing. You spent 3 years developing classified military responses to hypothetical foreign attacks, Harrison corrected. You conducted unauthorized research into military capabilities and limitations. You created software designed to override military aircraft safety systems. And you did all of this without military oversight or approval. The trap was closing around Sarah, and she could see no way out. Her preparation and foresight, the very qualities that had made her mission successful, were being twisted into evidence of criminal activity. The fact that she had been ready to save 10 million lives was being presented as proof that she had somehow known the attack was coming. General Harrison, Major Rodriguez interjected, Dr. Mitchell's security clearance specifically authorized theoretical weapons research. Her work was within the scope of her approved activities. Her security clearance authorized research, not development and testing of unauthorized military modifications, Harrison replied. Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you have any prior knowledge of the submarine attack that occurred this morning? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and Sarah understood that her answer would determine not just her immediate future, but potentially the rest of her life. If she answered incorrectly, if she provided any response that could be interpreted as suspicious, she would face federal charges for espionage and treason. "No," she said simply. "I had no prior knowledge of any specific attack. I developed the intercept solution because I believed ballistic missile threats were a growing danger to American cities. My work was based on general threat assessment, not specific intelligence." "Then explain," General Harrison said, "how you happen to have software and flight plans that were perfectly adapted to this morning's specific threat parameters." Sarah looked around the room at the assembled officers, seeing skepticism and suspicion in most of their faces. Only Colonel Thompson and Major Rodriguez seemed willing to consider that her preparations might have been motivated by legitimate concern rather than criminal conspiracy. "General," she said, "I designed the solution to be adaptable to a wide range of threat scenarios. The software calculates optimal intercept vectors based on real-time sensor data, not pre-programmed flight paths. The reason it worked this morning is because I designed it to work against any ballistic missile attack, regardless of specific parameters." "Very convenient," Harrison observed. "You developed a universal solution to a problem that had never occurred, using methods that had never been tested, and it worked perfectly on the first attempt." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, recognizing that her very competence was being used as evidence against her. In the military's institutional mindset, anyone who was too well prepared was automatically suspect. Anyone who had solutions ready for unprecedented problems was obviously guilty of something. "General Harrison," her father said, "speaking for the second time since the inquiry began, I request permission to address this panel privately." Harrison looked surprised. "General Mitchell, this is a formal inquiry. Private conversations are not appropriate." "General Harrison," Robert Mitchell said, standing to his full height and using the tone of voice that had intimidated subordinates for 30 years, "I am requesting 5 minutes of private consultation regarding information that may be relevant to this inquiry, but is not appropriate for general discussion." The two generals stared at each other across the conference table, and Sarah could feel the tension building between them. Her father was calling in decades of professional relationships and military courtesy to buy her some kind of protection, but she wasn't sure what he could say that would help her situation. "Very well," Harrison said finally. "This inquiry is recessed for 10 minutes. All personnel except General Mitchell and myself will leave the room immediately." As the other officers filed out of the conference room, Sarah caught her father's eye for just a moment. What she saw there wasn't the anger and disappointment she had expected. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like pride, mixed with a deep sadness that she couldn't quite interpret. The door closed behind the last officer, leaving Sarah standing alone in the hallway outside the conference room. Through the frosted glass, she could see the silhouettes of the two generals engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Voices were raised, though she couldn't make out specific words. Colonel Thompson approached her position by the door. "Dr. Mitchell, I want you to know that whatever happens in there, you did the right thing today. You saved 10 million lives, and that matters more than any protocol violation." "Thank you, Colonel," Sarah replied, though her attention was focused on the conversation happening behind the frosted glass. "But I'm not sure anyone else is going to see it that way." Major Rodriguez joined them in the hallway, looking genuinely concerned. "Sarah, what do you think your father is telling her?" Sarah shook her head slowly. "I have no idea. We haven't spoken in 3 years, and our last conversation didn't end well. I'm not even sure why he's here." "He's here," Colonel Thompson said quietly, "because someone called him the moment your name appeared in the mission reports. General Mitchell may have issues with your career choices, but you're still his daughter." Through the glass, Sarah could see her father gesturing emphatically while General Harrison listened with obvious skepticism. Whatever he was telling her, it wasn't being received well. After several more minutes of heated discussion, both generals sat down, and their conversation became more subdued. Finally, the door opened and General Harrison emerged, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Mitchell, please return to the conference room. The rest of you, remain in the hallway until called." Sarah walked back into the conference room to find her father standing by the window, looking out at the flight line where F-35s were being prepared for routine training missions. He didn't turn around when she entered, and General Harrison waited until the door was closed before speaking. "Dr. Mitchell," Harrison said, "your father has provided information that changes the context of this inquiry significantly. Information that explains both your preparation for this morning's mission and your access to relevant technical resources." Sarah looked back and forth between the two generals, completely confused about what could have been said to alter the trajectory of the investigation. Her father finally turned from the window, and she could see that his earlier anger had been replaced by something that looked almost like resignation. "Sarah," he said quietly, "General Harrison needed to understand why you were so well prepared for this mission. She needed to understand why you had access to classified information, and why you were willing to risk your life for people you'd never met." "I don't understand," Sarah replied. "What did you tell her?" General Harrison answered instead. "He told me that you've been preparing for this kind of mission your entire life. That you've been denied military service not because of lack of qualifications, but because your father used his influence to keep you out of situations exactly like this morning's crisis." Sarah felt the room spinning slightly as the implications of that statement hit her. "What?" "He told me," Harrison continued, "that you applied to the Air Force Academy twice and were rejected both times, not because of your qualifications, but because he personally intervened to prevent your acceptance. He told me that you've been developing theoretical military solutions because it was the only way you could contribute to national defense while being denied the opportunity to serve directly." Sarah turned to stare at her father, seeing 30 years of family conflict. Suddenly recontextualized, "You sabotaged my applications?" "I protected you," Robert Mitchell replied, his voice defensive. "I kept you out of situations where you might be killed or captured or forced to make impossible choices. I kept you safe." "You kept me powerless," Sarah shot back, feeling decades of suppressed resentment finally breaking free. "You denied me the chance to serve my country because you were afraid I might be good at it." "I was afraid you might die for it," her father said, his voice breaking slightly. "I was afraid you might face exactly the kind of situation you faced this morning, where the only solution required sacrificing yourself for others." The conference room fell silent as the real dynamic behind the day's events became clear. This wasn't just about protocol violations or security breaches. This was about a father who had spent 30 years trying to protect his daughter from her own courage, and a daughter who had finally found a way to serve despite his protection. General Harrison watched the exchange between father and daughter with growing understanding. "General Mitchell also informed me that your theoretical weapons research has been funded and supported by his personal recommendation for the past 5 years. Your security clearance, your access to classified information, your consultation contracts with aerospace manufacturers, all of it was arranged to give you a way to contribute to military capabilities without actually serving in the military." Sarah looked at her father with a mixture of gratitude and betrayal. "You've been manipulating my career for 5 years? I've been trying to find a way for you to do what you love without getting yourself killed," he replied. "I thought if you could work on theoretical problems, if you could contribute to military science from a safe distance, you might be satisfied with that." "But I wasn't satisfied," Sarah said quietly. "I never could be, because the work wasn't real. It was just intellectual exercise without practical application." "Until this morning," General Harrison observed, "when your theoretical work became the only thing standing between 10 million Americans and certain death." The weight of that realization settled over all three of them. For 30 years, Robert Mitchell had been fighting to keep his daughter away from exactly the kind of situation that had occurred that morning. And for 30 years, Sarah had been preparing for exactly that situation, driven by a sense of duty and capability that couldn't be satisfied with theoretical contributions alone. So what happens now? Sarah asked, looking back and forth between the two generals. General Harrison consulted her notes one final time. Now, Dr. Mitchell, we acknowledge that you saved 10 million American lives using knowledge and capabilities that you developed specifically for that purpose. We acknowledge that your actions, while technically violations of military protocol, were taken in good faith to prevent a catastrophic loss of civilian life. Sarah felt a surge of relief, but Harrison wasn't finished. However, the general continued, we also acknowledge that you have demonstrated capabilities and knowledge that make you far too valuable to remain in civilian status. Dr. Mitchell, you are hereby offered a direct commission as a major in the United States Air Force with assignment to Air Combat Command's Advanced Tactical Development Division. Sarah stared at Harrison in shock. After 30 years of being denied military service, she was being offered not just acceptance, but immediate recognition of her abilities and knowledge. Furthermore, Harrison continued, your theoretical weapons research will be converted to official military development programs with appropriate funding and resources. Your intercept software will be tested and integrated into Air Force defensive systems, and your expertise in ballistic missile defense will be used to develop countermeasures against future threats. Sarah looked at her father, seeing pride and sadness warring in his expression. He had spent 30 years trying to protect her from military service, only to watch her earn that service through an act of heroism that perfectly embodied everything he had feared. General Harrison, Sarah said slowly, I appreciate the offer, but I need to understand something. Is this commission being offered because of my qualifications and my actions today? Or is it being offered because keeping me under military authority is the only way to control the security implications of what I know? Harrison smiled for the first time since the inquiry had begun. Dr. Mitchell, it's being offered because this morning you proved that you're exactly the kind of officer the Air Force needs. Someone who can think beyond conventional solutions, who can act decisively under impossible pressure, and who can sacrifice personal considerations for larger purposes. She paused, looking directly at Sarah with something approaching respect. The fact that keeping you under military authority also solves several security and oversight issues is simply a beneficial side effect. Sarah turned to her father one more time. What do you think I should do? Robert Mitchell was quiet. For a long moment, looking at his daughter with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time in 30 years. I think, he said finally, that I should have trusted you to make your own choices a long time ago. I think you've proven today that you're capable of handling responsibilities I was afraid to let you accept. He straightened to his full height, assuming the formal posture of a senior military officer addressing a subordinate. Major Mitchell, he said, using her new rank for the first time, I think you should accept the commission and continue serving your country in the way you've always wanted to. Sarah felt tears building in her eyes as she realized that her father was finally acknowledging not just her capabilities, but her right to use them in service to others. After 30 years of waiting, Sarah was finally being recognized, not as a favor, but as acknowledgement of what she'd already proven herself capable of. General Harrison, she said, standing at attention, I accept the commission and the assignment. When do I start? You already have, Harrison replied. Your first task is to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff tomorrow at the Pentagon. You'll need to explain this morning's incident and provide strategic recommendations for future defenses. As Sarah stepped out of the room in the uniform she'd never been allowed to earn, she couldn't ignore the irony. Her father's Attempts to protect her from military service had driven her to build a skill set that made her indispensable. By trying to keep her out of harm's way, he had unwittingly prepared her for the most dangerous mission imaginable, and she'd succeeded. Not in spite of his restrictions, but because she had learned to work around them. She had become the very kind of warrior no one expected, and exactly the kind the country now needed. The Pentagon buzzed with a different kind of energy than she'd ever known as a civilian. Wearing the crisp Air Force uniform, Major Sarah Mitchell walked its halls under the gaze of generals whose portraits lined the walls, men and women who had shaped national defense strategy for decades. Tomorrow she'd stand before those very leaders and explain how a math equation had saved 10 million lives. But tonight, in General Harrison's office overlooking the Potomac, she was beginning to see the deeper implications of what had happened. The general was reviewing a stack of high-level classified reports, each marked for limited distribution. Sarah sat quietly, the weight of her new rank settling on her shoulders. "Major Mitchell," Harrison said, eyes still on the documents, "do you understand what you've really accomplished?" "I'm not sure I do, General," Sarah replied, still adjusting to how quickly her life had changed. Harrison finally looked up, her gaze serious. "You didn't just save lives, you changed global strategy. Every intelligence agency is scrambling to understand how a conventional fighter jet intercepted a Russian Sarmat missile going Mach 23. The room felt colder. Sarah hadn't yet considered the broader consequences. "You think they're trying to copy it?" "They're all trying, allies and enemies alike," Harrison said. "Your technique is the biggest leap in missile defense since the Patriot system. Everyone wants to replicate it or render it obsolete." She opened one of the reports, showing images of debris spread across the Pacific and technical breakdowns of the intercept. "The British want technical briefings. The French want to buy your software. The Russians are demanding answers." Sarah looked at the photos, her split-second decision now reduced to data, angles, and debris fields. What had once been a desperate maneuver was now a template for global defense shifts. "And China?" she asked, noticing the absence of any reference to them. Harrison's expression tightened. "They've gone silent, which means they're analyzing, developing, and probably accelerating hypersonic programs of their own." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. Her actions had sparked a new arms race. What she'd done to save lives had set off a wave of military escalation. "Are you saying I made the world more dangerous?" she asked quietly. Harrison considered. I'm saying that every breakthrough brings new risks. You've given us an edge, but it's a temporary one. Others are already working to counter it. That's the nature of defense innovation." She stood, walking to the window overlooking Arlington Cemetery, white headstones stretching into the distance. Her voice softened. "There's something else, Sarah. Something personal." Sarah waited. "Your father didn't just steer you away from the military. He actively kept you hidden from it. For years, General Robert Mitchell has led the charge for missile defense innovation. He's fought for funding, talent, and support for the very kind of intercept system you demonstrated." The words hit Sarah hard. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's been describing technology that sounded impossible. Collision intercepts against hypersonic missiles, precision modeling for real-time engagement, computer-assisted piloting under extreme conditions. Capabilities only you could provide, but he blocked you from joining the programs that needed them." Harrison turned back to face her. "He's been fighting a war in policy and planning, building systems around your talents, while keeping you away from the battlefield. Until now. Everything you accomplished yesterday, he's been advocating for development programs to achieve." Sarah felt the familiar sensation of her world shifting beneath her feet. "He knew I could do this? He knew you were developing the capabilities to do this," Harrison corrected. "Your theoretical weapons research wasn't just random consultation work. It was specifically designed to let you develop solutions to problems he knew the military would eventually face, while keeping you safely away from situations where you might have to implement those solutions personally. The cruel irony of the situation became clear to Sarah with devastating clarity. Her father had spent 15 years creating opportunities for her to contribute to military science while denying her the chance to serve directly. He had built a system that would benefit from her intellect while protecting her from the risks of military service. And that system had ultimately led to exactly the situation he had tried to prevent. So when the crisis came, Sarah said slowly, I was the only person ready to solve it because he had been preparing me to solve it while trying to make sure I would never have to. Precisely, Harrison confirmed. And now we have a problem. That goes far beyond individual family dynamics or military protocol violations. Harrison returned to her desk and opened another classified file, this one containing photographs of military installations and personnel that Sarah didn't recognize. Major Mitchell, your success yesterday has made you the most valuable military asset in American missile defense capabilities. You possess knowledge and experience that no one else has. You've proven capabilities that were previously theoretical, and you've demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking that could determine the outcome of future conflicts. Sarah studied the photographs, seeing facilities that looked like advanced testing centers and research installations. General, what exactly are you asking me to do? I'm not asking, Major. I'm informing you of your new assignment. You've been selected to lead the development of advanced intercept capabilities for the Air Force's Special Projects Division. You'll have unlimited funding, access to the most advanced aircraft and simulation equipment available, and a team of the finest engineers and pilots in the military. The scope of what Harrison was describing began to overwhelm Sarah's ability to process it. You want me to militarize the technique I used yesterday? I want you to revolutionize American missile defense capabilities, Harrison corrected. The collision intercept method you developed is just the beginning. We need defensive systems that can handle multiple simultaneous threats, hypersonic missiles with evasive capabilities, and attack scenarios that conventional weapons simply cannot address. Sarah looked down at her hands, thinking about the mathematical models she had developed during 3 years of solitary research. Those equations had been academic exercises, intellectual challenges that satisfied her curiosity about theoretical problems. The idea of transforming them into weapon systems designed for actual warfare felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she was prepared to cross. General Harrison, she said quietly, I developed the intercept technique to save lives, not to create new categories of military weapons. Major Mitchell, Harrison replied with steel in her voice, you developed the intercept technique because you understood that American civilians needed protection from threats that our existing systems couldn't handle. That motivation hasn't changed. The only difference is the scale of the responsibility. Harrison opened one final classified report, revealing intelligence assessments that made Sarah's heart rate increase dramatically. These are threat projections based on current missile development programs in Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Within 5 years, each of these nations will possess hypersonic delivery systems capable of striking American cities with nuclear warheads. Our current defensive systems have zero probability of successful intercept against these weapons. The photograph showed missile designs that looked like science fiction, sleek, angular weapons capable of maneuvering during flight, changing course to avoid defensive systems, and delivering devastating payloads with pinpoint accuracy. Sarah could see immediately that conventional intercept methods would be useless against such weapons. Without advanced defensive capabilities, Harrison continued, American cities will be completely vulnerable to hypersonic attack within the next decade. Your collision intercept technique represents the only promising approach to defending against these weapons. But one technique isn't enough. We need a complete defensive system based on the principles you've demonstrated. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cemetery where thousands of service members had been laid to rest after sacrificing their lives for national defense. She understood that Harrison was offering her the opportunity to prevent future casualties on a scale that dwarfed even yesterday's potential disaster in Los Angeles. What would this assignment actually involve? Sarah asked. You would work with a team of the most advanced aerospace engineers in the world to develop collision intercept systems that could be deployed on multiple platforms, Harrison explained. Fighter aircraft, unmanned drones, satellite-based interceptors, and potentially ground-launched defensive missiles. Your mathematical models would be refined and adapted for different threat scenarios, and your software would be developed into integrated defensive networks. The technical challenges involved in such a project were staggering, but Sarah could see the elegant beauty of the potential solutions. Instead of trying to match the speed and maneuverability of hypersonic weapons, defensive systems could use precision collision techniques to alter their trajectories or destroy their guidance systems. It was a fundamentally different approach to missile defense, based on mathematics and physics rather than overwhelming firepower. How long would such a project take? Sarah asked. Initial prototypes within 18 months, Harrison replied. Full deployment capability within 3 years. But Major Mitchell, there's something else you need to understand about this assignment. Sarah turned from the window, recognizing the tone in Harrison's voice that indicated she was about to learn something significant. The Russians know. You survived yesterday's collision, Harrison said quietly. Their intelligence services have identified you as the pilot who developed and executed the intercept technique. They've classified you as a high-value target for elimination or capture. The words hit Sarah like ice water in her veins. What does that mean? It means that as of this morning, you're under 24-hour protection by Air Force security. Police. It means your movements are restricted to secure military installations. And it means that accepting this assignment will essentially end your civilian life permanently. Sarah sank back into her chair, understanding that the choice Harrison was offering wasn't really a choice at all. She possessed knowledge that could protect millions of American lives, but utilizing that knowledge would make her a target for elimination by hostile intelligence services. She could save her country, but she would lose her freedom in the process. There's more, Harrison continued. The Chinese have approached your father with an offer to purchase information about your research and capabilities. They've offered him $50 million for technical specifications and biographical information that would help them develop countermeasures against your intercept techniques. Sarah's head snapped up in shock. What did he tell them? He told them to go to hell, Harrison replied with a slight smile. But the fact that they made the offer indicates how seriously they take the threat your capabilities represent to their strategic planning. The full scope of the situation was becoming clear to Sarah with horrible clarity. Her moment of heroism had made her the center of an international intelligence competition. Nations were trying to recruit her, purchase her knowledge, or eliminate her as a threat. Her father's 30-year effort to protect her had ultimately placed her in exactly the kind of danger he had tried to prevent. General Harrison, Sarah said, what happens if I refuse the assignment? What if I want to return to civilian life and forget about advanced missile defense systems? Harrison's expression became grave. Major Mitchell, you can't return to civilian life. You possess classified knowledge about American defensive capabilities that makes you a permanent security risk. Even if you wanted to refuse the assignment, you would remain under military authority for the rest of your life. The trap closed around Sarah with the inexorable logic of national security requirements. She had volunteered for one suicide mission to save 10 million lives. And that heroic act had committed her to a lifetime of military service, whether she wanted it or not. But, Harrison continued, if you accept the assignment, You'll have the opportunity to build defensive systems that could protect hundreds of millions of American lives for generations to come. You'll lead the most advanced military research program in the world with resources and authority that most officers can only dream of. Sarah looked back out the window at Arlington Cemetery, thinking about all the service members who had made sacrifices for national defense. Some had given their lives in single moments of heroism, while others had devoted entire careers to protecting American interests. She was being asked to make a different kind of sacrifice, giving up her personal freedom to develop capabilities that might prevent future wars. "There's one more thing you should know," Harrison said, opening a final folder on her desk. "Your intercept technique worked perfectly yesterday, but our analysis of the missile debris has revealed something unexpected." Sarah turned her attention back to the general, wondering what new revelation could possibly add to the complexity of her situation. "The Russian missile you intercepted wasn't just carrying a conventional warhead," Harrison said quietly. "It was carrying a nuclear weapon with a yield of approximately 500 kilotons. If it had reached Los Angeles, it wouldn't have killed 10 million people. It would have killed 20 million and rendered most of Southern California uninhabitable." For decades, the magnitude of what she had prevented hit Sarah like a tsunami. She had saved not just the immediate population of Los Angeles, but generations of Americans who would have suffered from radiation poisoning, economic collapse, and the environmental devastation of nuclear attack on American soil. "The Russians launched a nuclear attack on American civilians," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They launched a deniable nuclear attack disguised as the action of a rogue submarine," Harrison corrected. "They were prepared to claim that the submarine had been stolen by terrorists or operated by a splinter military faction. It would have been the perfect attack, devastating damage to American capabilities with no clear target for retaliation." Sarah understood that she had prevented not just a humanitarian catastrophe, but a potential nuclear war. If a Russian nuclear weapon had detonated in Los Angeles, the American response would have been swift and overwhelming. Millions of people in multiple countries would have died in the escalation that followed. So accepting this assignment isn't just about developing defensive systems, Sarah realized. It's about preventing nuclear war. It's about making sure that what happened yesterday never happens again, Harrison confirmed. "Your collision intercept technique may be the only thing standing between American cities and nuclear annihilation. The question is whether you're willing to accept the responsibility that comes with that knowledge." Sarah stood at the window for a long time, watching the sun set over Arlington Cemetery. She thought about her father's 30-year campaign to protect her from exactly this moment, and how all his efforts had ultimately led her to face a choice between personal freedom and national survival. She thought about the 10 million people in Los Angeles who had gone to bed last night, completely unaware that they had been saved from nuclear incineration by a mathematical equation and a woman willing to sacrifice herself for strangers. She thought about the 20 million Americans who would die if the next Russian missile succeeded, and the generations of children who would grow up in a world where American cities could be destroyed without warning or consequence. "General Harrison," Sarah said finally, turning from the window to face her new commanding officer, "when do we start?" Harrison smiled with what looked like genuine relief. "We already have, Major Mitchell. Your security detail is waiting outside to escort you to your new laboratory. Your team of engineers is already assembling, and your first prototype aircraft is being prepared for testing at Area 51. As Sarah walked toward the door that would lead her into a new life of military service and scientific innovation, she realized that her father's worst fears had come true. She was now committed to a career that would place her in constant danger, working on projects that could determine the survival of American civilization. But she was also fulfilling the potential he had recognized in her 30 years ago. when he first decided that flying was too dangerous for his little girl. The general's daughter was finally free to serve her country at the highest levels, even if that freedom came at the cost of every other kind of freedom she had ever known. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to save her from military service, her father had shaped her into exactly the kind of officer the military needed most. Someone capable of thinking beyond conventional solutions and willing to sacrifice everything for the protection of others. Major Sarah Mitchell walked out of the Pentagon that evening knowing that she would never again be just the general's daughter. She was now the woman who had saved 20 million Americans from nuclear annihilation, and the officer responsible for making sure such salvation would never again require a suicide mission. The decoration had become the warrior, and the warrior would spend the rest of her life making sure that no one else would ever have to make the choice she had made above the Pacific Ocean, 2 years after the incident that changed everything. Major Sarah Mitchell stood in the control room of the most advanced military facility that officially didn't exist. The Nevada Test and Training Range stretched endlessly beyond the reinforced windows, its desert landscape hiding technologies that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. On the screen surrounding her workstation, real-time data flowed from 12 different aircraft conducting simultaneous collision intercept trials against simulated hypersonic threats. The woman looking back at her from the reflection in the darkened glass bore little resemblance to the civilian contractor who had walked into Edwards Air Force Base that fateful morning. Her hair was shorter now, regulation length, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen theoretical mathematics transform into weapons, systems capable of reshaping global military strategy. The silver oak leaves on her uniform indicated her recent promotion to lieutenant colonel, recognition of achievements that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. "Colonel Mitchell," came a voice from across the control room. Captain Jennifer Walsh, her lead systems engineer, was monitoring telemetry from Test Vehicle 7 as it approached an intercept scenario that would have been suicide for any human pilot. "The AI guidance system is performing flawlessly. Intercept probability is holding steady at 97%. Sarah nodded, watching as her mathematical models guided an unmanned aircraft through maneuvers that defied conventional understanding of defensive capabilities. The collision intercept technique that had required her personal sacrifice 2 years ago was now being executed by artificial intelligence systems that could calculate approach vectors faster than human thought and survive impact forces that would liquefy organic pilots. "Initiate the intercept sequence," Sarah ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned command through extraordinary circumstances rather than traditional military progression. On the primary display screen, 2 objects converged at impossible speeds. The target drone, designed to simulate a Russian hypersonic missile, streaked across the Nevada sky at Mach 18. The interceptor, guided by Sarah's collision prediction software and equipped with reinforced impact systems, approached from an angle that physics said should be impossible to calculate in real time. The collision happened in a burst of light and debris that registered across multiple sensor systems simultaneously. Within milliseconds, computers analyzed the impact dynamics, trajectory changes, and destruction patterns. The results appeared on Sarah's screen as a simple message: intercept successful, target destroyed, mission parameters achieved. "That's the 47th consecutive successful test," Captain Walsh announced, unable to keep the excitement out of her voice. "Colonel, your intercept system has achieved a success rate that exceeds any defensive capability in military history." Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what these successful tests really meant. Each perfect intercept brought the world one step closer to a new kind of warfare, where defensive systems could neutralize the most advanced offensive weapons ever created. But it also brought hostile nations one step closer to developing countermeasures that could overcome those defenses. "Any word from the evaluation board?" Sarah asked, referring to the classified group of military leaders who would determine whether her defensive systems were ready for operational deployment. They're scheduled to arrive next week for the final demonstration, Walsh replied. Colonel, if this test series continues at current performance levels, your intercept systems could be protecting American cities within 6 months. The prospect should have filled Sarah with pride, but instead it reminded her of the personal cost of her achievements. She had created defensive systems that could save millions of lives, but she had also created a prison for herself. The knowledge she possessed, the capabilities she had developed, and the threats she understood made her simultaneously invaluable and permanently isolated from the civilian world she had once known. A soft chime indicated an incoming communication on the secure command channel. Sarah touched her earpiece to accept the call, recognizing the voice of General Patricia Harrison immediately. Colonel Mitchell, I need you in Conference Room Alpha. Immediately, we have a situation developing. The tone in Harrison's voice sent a chill through Sarah's stomach. In the 2 years since her assignment to the Special Projects Division, she had learned to recognize the subtle variations in her commanding officer's speech patterns. This particular tone meant that something had gone seriously wrong in the larger world beyond their classified testing facility. Sarah made her way through corridors lined with blast-resistant walls and biometric security checkpoints, past laboratories where teams of engineers were developing technologies that existed at the intersection of theoretical physics and practical warfare. The facility had become her entire world, a self-contained universe where mathematical equations became defensive systems and where the abstract concepts she had studied in graduate school transformed into hardware capable of protecting entire cities. Conference Room Alpha was designed for discussions of the most sensitive military secrets, equipped with electronic countermeasures that prevented any form of surveillance or recording. General Harrison sat at the head of the conference table, studying satellite imagery displayed on wall-mounted screens. Beside her sat Colonel Marcus Reed, Director of Military Intelligence for the Special Projects Division, and Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the civilian scientist who served as Sarah's theoretical mathematics consultant. Colonel Mitchell, Harrison said without preamble, 3 hours ago, Chinese surveillance satellites detected our intercept testing activities. They know we've achieved operational capability with collision intercept systems. Sarah took her seat at the conference table, immediately understanding the implications of that revelation. How much do they know about the specific capabilities? Everything, Colonel Reed replied grimly. Their analysis of our test telemetry has been remarkably accurate. They understand the success rates, the intercept methodologies, and the technological principles involved. More importantly, they understand that our defensive systems represent a fundamental shift in strategic military balance. Dr. Chen activated a display screen showing intelligence assessments from multiple sources. Sarah, the Chinese response has been immediate and comprehensive. They've accelerated their hypersonic missile development programs, initiated crash programs to develop countermeasures against collision intercept systems, and begun diplomatic outreach to other nations offering technology sharing agreements. The implications were staggering. Sarah's defensive systems had been designed to protect American cities from hypersonic attack, but their existence was now driving an international arms race that could destabilize global military relationships for decades. There's more, General, Harrison said, her expression growing even more serious. The Russians have approached the United Nations with a formal complaint alleging that American collision intercept systems violate existing arms control treaties. They're demanding international oversight of our defensive capabilities and threatening to withdraw from nuclear limitation agreements if their demands aren't met. Sarah felt the familiar weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders. Every solution she created seemed to generate new problems that were beyond her ability to control or predict. Her mathematical models could calculate intercept vectors with incredible precision, but they couldn't account for the complex political and strategic reactions that her technological achievements triggered. "What are our options?" Sarah asked. "That depends," Harrison replied, "on how quickly we can achieve full operational deployment of your defensive systems. If we can protect major American cities before hostile nations develop effective countermeasures, we maintain strategic advantage. If we delay deployment while trying to address international concerns, we risk leaving American civilians vulnerable to the very threats your systems were designed to counter." Colonel Reed opened a classified briefing folder. "Colonel Mitchell, intelligence assessments indicate that both Russia and China will possess advanced hypersonic delivery systems capable of striking American targets within the next 8 months. Without your defensive systems in place, our cities will be completely vulnerable to nuclear attack with virtually no warning time." The pressure of national survival was bearing down on Sarah with crushing force. She had created defensive capabilities that could save millions of lives, but deploying those capabilities would trigger international reactions that could lead to the very conflicts they were designed to prevent. "There's something else you need to know," Dr. Chun said quietly. "The mathematical principles underlying your collision intercept technique have applications beyond defensive systems. Several nations are exploring offensive uses for collision dynamics in space-based weapons and anti-satellite systems." Sarah stared at the scientist in shock. "They're weaponizing my defensive mathematics? They're adapting your theoretical work for applications you never intended," Chen replied. "Your collision prediction algorithms could be used to develop weapons that destroy satellites, space stations, or even other spacecraft through precisely calculated impacts. The same mathematical models that protect cities could be used to cripple global communications or navigation systems." The revelation was like a knife through Sarah's chest. She had spent 3 years developing mathematical solutions to save lives, only to discover that those solutions could be transformed into weapons capable of unprecedented destruction. Her defensive equations were becoming offensive capabilities in the hands of nations that viewed collision dynamics as tools of warfare rather than protection. "General Harrison," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing, "what exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to make a choice that will affect the security of American civilians for the next 50 years, Harrison replied. "We can deploy your defensive systems immediately, accepting the international consequences and the arms race that will follow. Or we can delay deployment while attempting to negotiate international agreements that might prevent the weaponization of your theoretical work." Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking the Nevada desert, thinking about the impossible mathematics of moral decision-making. Every choice seemed to lead to outcomes that were simultaneously beneficial and catastrophic, protective and dangerous, necessary and unacceptable. "How long would international negotiations take?" Sarah asked. "Minimum of 2 years, Colonel," Reed replied. "More likely 5 to 8 years, assuming successful agreement can be reached at all. During that time, American cities would remain vulnerable to hypersonic attack, while hostile nations continue developing both offensive and defensive capabilities." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the moment 2 years ago when she had flown directly into a Russian missile to save 10 million lives. That choice had been simple: sacrifice herself to protect others. This choice was infinitely more complex: deploy systems that could save millions while risking global conflict or delay deployment while accepting the possibility that millions might die from threats her systems could have prevented. "There's one more factor to consider," General Harrison said. "Your father has requested permission to speak with you about this decision." Sarah turned from the window, surprised by the mention of her father. She hadn't spoken with General Robert Mitchell since accepting her current assignment, though she knew he had been briefed on her work and its implications. He's here? He's waiting in conference room Bravo, Harrison replied. He flew in this morning specifically to discuss the deployment decision with you. Colonel Mitchell, your father has been involved in strategic planning discussions at the highest levels of military leadership. His perspective on these issues carries significant weight with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Sarah hesitated, uncertain whether a conversation with her father would clarify her decision or complicate it further. Their relationship had been strained by 30 years of conflict over her military aspirations, and she wasn't sure that recent events had resolved the fundamental disagreements between them. I'll speak with him, Sarah decided. But General, I want to be clear that this decision is mine to make. I won't allow family dynamics to override strategic considerations. Understood, Harrison replied. But Colonel, your father knows things about the broader strategic situation that might influence your thinking. Information that's been classified above your current clearance level. The implication that there were aspects of the situation she didn't fully understand sent another chill through Sarah's chest. She had assumed that her position as the developer of collision intercept systems gave her access to all relevant information about deployment decisions. The possibility that crucial facts were being withheld suggested that the situation was even more complex than she had realized. Conference Room Bravo was smaller and less formal than the main briefing facility, designed for private conversations rather than large-scale strategic planning. General Robert Mitchell sat at a small table, wearing his dress uniform and looking older than Sarah remembered. The past 2 years had added lines to his face and gray to his hair, physical evidence of the stress that came with high-level military leadership during periods of international tension. "Hello, Sarah," he said as she entered the room. "You look well. Command suits you." Sarah took the seat across from her father, studying his expression for clues about the purpose of his visit. "Hello, Dad. General Harrison said you wanted to discuss the deployment decision. I wanted to tell you about information that hasn't been included in your briefings," Robert Mitchell replied. "Information that might affect your thinking about the risks and benefits of immediate deployment." Sarah waited, recognizing the careful tone her father used when discussing classified information that pushed the boundaries of security protocols. "3 weeks ago," he continued, "Russian submarine forces conducted exercises off the coast of Virginia that simulated nuclear missile launches against Washington, D.C. and New York City. The exercises used the same class of submarine that launched the missile you intercepted 2 years ago." The implications hit Sarah immediately. "They're preparing for another attack." "They're preparing for multiple attacks," her father corrected. "Intelligence assessments indicate that Russian strategic planning now includes scenarios for simultaneous hypersonic strikes against 6 major American cities. Without your defensive systems, those attacks would succeed with catastrophic results." Sarah felt the weight of 20 million lives settling on her shoulders again. How certain is this intelligence? Certain enough that the president has been briefed and contingency plans are being developed for civilian evacuations. Robert Mitchell replied, "Sarah, the deployment of your defensive systems isn't just a strategic advantage. It's an immediate necessity for American survival." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, during which Sarah learned about Russian military preparations, Chinese offensive capabilities, and international intelligence assessments that painted a picture of imminent threats to American cities. By the time she returned to Conference Room Alpha, her decision had crystallized with mathematical clarity. "General Harrison," she said, addressing her commanding officer with the formality appropriate to momentous decisions, "I recommend immediate deployment of collision intercept systems to protect all major American population centers. The international consequences are acceptable when weighed against the probability of successful hostile attacks against American civilians." Harrison nodded slowly, understanding that Sarah's recommendation would trigger a cascade of military Preparations that would reshape American defensive capabilities permanently. Colonel Mitchell, are you prepared to oversee the deployment process personally? Yes, ma'am. I'll coordinate with regional commands to establish intercept stations and train personnel in system operations. Estimated deployment timeline is 90 days for initial operational capability, 6 months for comprehensive coverage. As Sarah walked out of the conference room that would change the course of military history, she realized that her transformation from civilian contractor to strategic military leader was finally complete. The general's daughter had become a general herself in all but name, responsible for decisions that would affect the survival of American civilization. 6 months later, as she stood in a similar control room watching real-time defensive coverage of American airspace, Sarah understood that her journey from decoration to warrior had ended exactly where her father had always feared it would. She was now permanently committed to military service, permanently isolated from civilian life, and permanently responsible for protecting millions of people she would never meet. But she was also exactly where she belonged, using mathematical precision to save lives on a scale that justified every sacrifice she had made. The general's daughter had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with equations that transform theoretical possibilities into practical protection. The decoration had become the Defender and American. Cities slept safely under the mathematical umbrella of collision intercept systems that turned certain death into mere statistical improbability. Sarah Mitchell had found her purpose in the intersection of mathematics and heroism, where theoretical knowledge became the foundation of national survival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.